Hello and welcome. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fascinating new panel that we have today. The title is Technical Standards Bringing Together Data Protection with Telecommunications Regulation, Digital Regulations and Procurement. I will first have a short introduction of our panelists, and I'll do that in alphabetical order. And because all have a very impressive CV, I will highlight just a few for this short round. So the first is Amelia Andersdotter. Amelia is affiliated with the dataskid.net and is an active contributor in the Institute of Electronical and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, and most notably for the recommended practices for privacy considerations, the so-called P802E. That were recently released. She's also a member, or has been a member of the European Parliament between 2011 and 2014. Next is Clara Nappel. Very happy and pleased that she's with us today. Clara is the Senior Director for the IEEE European Office in Vienna, where she's responsible for the growth of IEEE's operations and presence in Europe, focusing on the needs of everybody involved, like industry, academia, and government. Our third panelist is Francesca Bria. She's not on the screen yet, but we're trying very hard to bring her in. Francesca is the president of the Italian National Innovation Fund. She's also an honorary professor in the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at the UCL in London, and a senior advisor to the United Nations on Digital Cities and Digital Rights. Then we have Mikolas Peksa. Mikolas is a Czech biophysicist, a political activist, and also, of course, an elected member of the European Parliament. And his work falls under the committees of industry, research, and energy, as well as budgetary control, economic and monetary affairs, and tax matters. And finally, Paul Nemetz. Everybody knows Paul, and Paul is the principal advisor in the Directorate of Justice and Consumers. Before that, he was appointed as Director for Fundamental Rights and Citizens' Rights in that same directorate. My name is Rob van Eyck. I'm the Managing Director for the Future of Privacy Forum, a non-profit organization with a focus on bridging the policymaker industry academic gap for privacy. I joined FPF after working for the Dutch DPA for nearly 10 years. So with that, the scoping for today's panel session, we have more than an hour to discuss these. It's basically the key question, how to bridge the gap between releasing technical standards and embedding these into products and services available in the market. And in this panel, we explore issues as privacy standards are there, but why are these not quickly adopted? Or to what extent is there a lack of holistic privacy technology work? And what about interoperability? And for example, decentralization? Well, to kickstart this discussion, we'll listen to the perspectives on these questions that will help us understand the issues at hand. And let's start with a short tour de table to understand the different perspectives. And we will go clockwise. So Paul will be first, and then Clara, then Francesca, then Mikolas, and then Amelia. So Paul, the floor is yours. We're trying to get Paul back in, but for now, then we will have Clara.
Thank you, Rob. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
I'm still there. Okay, thank you. So I would like to start by the question on why it is so difficult to implement privacy. What are the challenges there? And I would also like to start with a disclaimer that the opinions here are my own and not necessarily that of IEEE. But having said that, I think that the biggest challenge in my view is the definition. What do we mean by privacy can have the different meanings for different stakeholder groups. For the user perspective, privacy could mean that no data is shared, or that data is shared but they are anonymous, or that they can define different access levels for different kind of data. On the other hand, from the company perspective, Privacy could mean compliance alone, so that means compliance with the GDPR, but it can also mean a true value proposition for the customers, so data minimization. Okay, do you want me to continue or do you want to bring it in? Sorry?
Please continue, Clara, and then we bring Paul in.
Very good. Okay. I also see with great interest that apps like, for instance, now Clubhouse, which is very much hyped, are used also by quite prominent people without really taking into consideration possible privacy concerns. On the other hand, we have the Corona app, which is not being used as much as it was hoped for by the health officials, despite the fact that technically privacy is implemented there at a very high level. So the question is here, and here I come to the second challenge, namely the relationship between privacy and the other functionalities of the product and service. Privacy comes at a given price. It has an influence on accuracy, on performance, on effectiveness. So I think it is important to bring stakeholders together and to find the right balance. And one way of doing this is through standardization. And I think that this is particularly important nowadays when we are in the era of AI and IoT applications, because already of the sheer number of data. I just read recently that in 2020 alone, we have collected more than 60 zettabytes of data. And having this in mind, it becomes, of course, another challenge on how to take privacy into account. With AI, I also see the challenge of, particular challenge of inferred data, namely the data which is generated from the primary personal data, but that in my view also have privacy implications, such as, for instance, the predilection for developing certain diseases. I think that there are still unclear how this inferred data is being monitored and what kind of possibilities we have to correct this. So I see the third challenge with implementing privacy on in finding the right balance between social standards, organizational measures, and data governance measures, and technical measures such as encryption methods or de-anonymization techniques. So having now these three challenges that I just mentioned, namely definition, trade-offs between privacy and other functionalities, and also the trade-offs between data governance and technical measures, I think that standardization is really one of the means of open and consensus-based processes to bring together the stakeholders and first agree on what they mean with privacy, and then second, how to implement them.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Clara. That really sets the stage. Paul, you're back in. Great to have you here. What are your perspectives on the issue?
Thank you very much, and I very much liked the previous introduction speaker. And I would like to pick up the example of Clubhouse, because I do believe actually also for politicians and for political discourse, this new app, which basically allows, lunchtime discussion of 800 people on politics, or in Berlin or Prague or, wherever, in a very relaxed way, very interactive way, will become very, very important in political discourse. And you can already see many members of parliament flocking there. But to say that this shows that people don't care, and I think you used this formulation, doesn't matter what the privacy matters are, and how well this app handles privacy, to conclude that, I think that would be wrong. There are huge discussions, including inside Clubhouse, on the privacy implications of using this tool. And you see, this is the twist of the technical world. If in the digital sphere, a scope is, a place is created where you have to be as a politician, you know, to reach your audience. And you have to be there even if privacy is not respected. And so, you know, I think that shows the dilemma. And I do not believe it is a good way of approaching the subjects by putting forward, let's say, this conflict of objectives, or you have privacy. Apple is a good counterexample. Apple has become the most valued company on the stock exchange with a very aggressive privacy policy. It has understood to merge a good offering and service together with extremely high privacy standards in most cases. And I think that's what we should be evangelizing, and that's what we should hold out as an example, and not reach wrong conclusions, let's say, from new hypes which are out there. I would also say that we need to make more efforts to build coherent rules, and the coherence pertains to two axes. The first axis is on the legislative level, the coherence between all the different laws ruling the digital. In the European Union, we are now on course for adding yet another at least 4 or 5 bodies of regulations to the already existing body of legislative, which are you know, data protection regulation, net neutrality, copyright, and the existing acquis on security, network security. And I think all these rules are necessary because internet policy and internet regulation is societal regulation. These are not matters which can be left to technicians or to the engineers. How we regulate the internet is a highly political matter. It is essential for democracy to make these rules in a democratic process, and it is essential that also those people who are not technicians and not experts in this area but have interests in how our society runs in the broadest sense, that they engage in these processes. And we together face this challenge of really writing the rule book for our society through digital law for the 21st century. And that's now taking place in Brussels. And I think it is very important that the technical intelligentsia, those people who understand the technical minute details of this or that word in the regulation, or for that matter of the technology, that they engage the process and bring their knowledge to the table, like it's happening here in our panel today. That is good, because democracy needs the engagement of the engineers. You are shaping the society, you are shaping democracy, you are deciding whether fundamental rights are delivered or not. And we need you to engage also in this spirit. We need architects and engineers for democracy and of democracy. And I think this is one of the great challenges of our time, to convince those many people who have this technical knowledge, who work in the sector, whether in business or civil society, to really engage also in the formal lawmaking processes with their knowledge. And of course, it is also an obligation of those who propose the legislation and then who discuss it, namely the political institutions, to hold out their hands and open the doors and bring in the people who know the technology. But make no mistake, and this will be my last sentence, it is not that I'm saying that the engineers know better how to make legislation. There's one huge misunderstanding out in this world, which is that law should be like code. And I close by saying that the code is written for stupids. And who are the stupids? The stupids are the computers. The computers, they can't think for themselves. And that's why you constantly need updates of the software, and we see it on our mobile phone every 2 months. So to say that the law must be updated as quickly as the software and that it must be written as precisely and user-friendly as the software is a huge misunderstanding and is ideological, an ideological effort to impress the rules of engineering on democracy and society. And the huge difference is the law is not written for stupids, namely for computers. The law is written for people, and people can think themselves, which means when we use the law wisely and we put the language in the law wisely, we make it technology neutral, we use wording which are not the buzzword, but which can be reinterpreted in their meaning tomorrow when technology has moved on, when business models have moved on. If we write laws like that, then we need to update them every 2 months, but we can leave it to those who think themselves, namely those who apply the law, who put it in action, including the engineers, including the standard making bodies, and of course the judges, to concretize them. So we need law which is open to the future, which is technology neutral, and which makes good use of the advantage of human language over coding. And I would wish that in these discussions which we're having between the technical world and the world, let's say, of social science, of policy making, the world of democracy, we talk also about the fact that there are different mechanisms which make these worlds tick, even as we move into a world which is in large parts dominated by technical networks. This doesn't mean that democracy or law responds to the same type of, let's say, rules on functioning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Very enlightening. I can talk from experience that, and this also were the point that Clara brought in, that having the same view on the definitions and the terms is very important. So if you are working in a standards group on, for instance, a problem like tracking, experience shows that you can talk forever on what the meaning of privacy is or what is the meaning of tracking. But technologists do need clear definitions with bounded concepts, because otherwise it's very difficult for them starting from that vocabulary and translate that into the design of technology. So what would be very helpful, and this is what I want to park in our discussion for later on, is to think about the fact that maybe we need to embed the definitions in law such that they are clear and they are not open anymore for interpretation and for defining, such that the real work on how the technology should be designed can then actually take place. With that, I would like to see whether we can bring in Francesca. And I'm also waiting for a cue from our. Okay, thank you. So then, with that, we will give the floor to Nicolas at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. I hope I will somehow continue where Paul previously ended, in a way, because I think it is important. Like today, we are living in a really changing part. I mean, like this, what we are kind of like encountering now is sort of like another industrial revolution. That's a matter of fact. Like all the human activities, all the types of professions, they are changing. They are changing in quite a turbulent way, and we need to adapt it. And we need to ensure that our society will be able to absorb and digest these changes in a way which brings us, let's say, closer to democracy, which will preserve human dignity, which will preserve human privacy and the values it was based on originally. I mean, like, there are quite like different ways how to tackle it, and there exactly comes the point of like inviting people who from the technical intelligentsia to really like discuss those concepts, because the way how we are defining even the concepts of the networks, of the way how they are structured, of their architecture, is very much defining the rules of the future society. So we should think about them, and we should think about them in let's say, perspective. Clubhouse was previously mentioned here, but with the concerns of privacy. But like what we are talking here, like we are talking here about a space that was created where people are gathering, but the space is actually being currently controlled by a single company. I mean, like I have nothing specifically against Apple. I'm just like, or just have to admit that this is creating a new monopoly controlled space for the discussion, which will be kind of like controlled by a single entity. I mean, like this is the way how it was structured. Maybe we should think about like whether this sort of like architecture is the one we really want, we really desire, whether there should be a single entity controlling the public space we are all entering into. I mean, like the weeks before, we have had quite like emotive discussions about the events happening in the United States. The things that that happened due to President Trump's activity on Twitter were quite like nasty and quite dangerous. I'm the last person in this world to defend that, but what I have to admit was that was successful as long as Twitter and some other big American big techs allowed it, and stopped being successful as they decided to stop it. So this is making a society which is really like being dominated by very few centers of power. We should really think about like how to ensure that these centers of power are not even like becoming not are being created. I mean, like rather than having a single social network, maybe it would be better to have sort of like decentralized architecture where you would like exchange the messages in a similar way like you are exchanging between various mail servers. I mean, like for the email, there is no one really able to switch off all the emails in the world, to control all the emails of the world. You have various providers, you can choose whichever one you want, and of course, like if you are not satisfied, you can move to another one. And of course, there are spammers and people misusing the network. Okay, you can use spam filter and block them. That's possible. However, there is no single or overreaching authority that would control all the processing of the information. I believe that's important. I'm talking here a little bit as a person coming from the former Eastern Bloc. Like we have a lot of experience with this centralized way of processing information and controlling society. I think when planning the architecture that will like be platform for future societies, we should keep it in mind, and we should keep it decentralized as possible in order to prevent such an overtaking of control. On the other hand, besides the ensuring the interoperability and the decentralization, we should also try to provide the transparency and availability of the data. What I've learned in the European Parliament, and maybe it's just a practical example of what happens. We do see the common agriculture policy in the European Union, which is kind of like resulting into the situation that you have a big agricultural companies, sometimes even controlling the whole governments of some member states. They are kind of concentrating all the subsidies invested or the money invested through the common agricultural policies and sort of like misusing them. I was really like curious whether we are even able to track that process. We try to do, let's say, sort of like investigation or research to follow the financial flows. But even when we are talking about public money, I mean the taxpayers' money that are being spent from the public budget, it's not really easy to kind of like follow the structure of the companies that are receiving them, and to clarify who is staying behind and how much is the respective entity receiving. I found that a problem because like so far we have no real standards to observe, to present those data and to share them internationally. So it is very much like a political question whether you define such standards for exchange of data in that particular field, because it prevents that respective field from being misused by some mafias. I mean, at that point, I would stop because, like, we really need to go from case by case and look what type of data our society needs to publish and what type of data our society shall kind of like keep private, in order to really ensure that the platforms that will be created will provide us better and more democratic society rather than a totalitarian one.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. And to our viewers and listeners, we are going to revisit the interoperability of social networks via open standards after this tour de table when we open up our discussion. And I have some fire starter questions prepared to dive into a little bit more detail, but also to have some interaction between the panelists themselves. Now I'd like to give the floor to Amelia. Very eager to learn about your perspective on all this. Go ahead.
So, hi everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the warm introductions, Rob. I used to work with Article 19, which is a London-based human rights organization that had a special program dedicated to providing frameworks in technical standards bodies for assessing technical work with respect to established human rights and privacy norms. And so my particular work area was focused on wireless local area networks, or Wi-Fi, mobile networks, and internet protocols. And so between 2017 and 2020, I have done a lot of work directly engaging engineers who design the technologies that somehow build our digital world, in how it is most helpful for them to think about how to incorporate human rights values into the infrastructures that they build. And so the good news is that most major network-oriented technical standards bodies at this time, so the IEEE SA, which does Ethernet and the basis for the Wi-Fi standards, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, which develops most of the common features that we're using in our online, like web-based experiences, they have these frameworks in place, and they can actually use these types of almost checklist approaches to check whether they are in fact designing their technologies with a view to protecting human rights of end users eventually. These framework documents, I will argue, also contain trade-off assessments. So when you're making a trade-off between a business value and a privacy value, or when you're making a trade-off between security and privacy, or economics and security, or latency, or something else, it's basically all incorporated in there. But what I'm hoping that we'll be able to get back to later in this discussion that we're having, and I think some of our previous speakers already addressed this, is how do we also deal with the demand side for these frameworks? That it's true that we can engage with engineers and we can talk to engineers about how they can assess their work, and engineers can also be engaged in legislative discussions, and it's true that we need these types of cross-sectional debates. But on the demand side, when the public sector is deciding to build a public Wi-Fi network in their city, or on a public transport station, or in a school, when you're designing a website for your authority or for your company, how do we ensure that in these settings, people demanding products, people that are actually purchasing or putting effort into using these network technologies, that they are aware of these frameworks and that they know what are the right questions to ask of the people further up in the value chain. And so I think I will not take up more time than that on introducing my general impetus for this panel. I think this is a challenging question, given that we have so many privacy standards already in place, and we need to work out constructive ways of engaging more policy actors in creating the right demand for solutions that already exist.
Thank you, Amelia. Let me reiterate the central question that we are exploring today, which is how to bridge the gap between releasing technical standards and embedding these into products and services available on the market. Let me turn the discussion to Clara first by asking the question, Where do you see the challenges related to implementing privacy, and how can standardization help solving these challenges? And I think the beginning of the answer may actually touch on some of the points that Amelia just addressed.
Sorry. No, sorry for that. Yes, absolutely. And also to what Paul just mentioned, I think that, the Clubhouse example that I mentioned before, it was provocatively stated that functionality beats privacy. And I hope that in my remarks, I wanted to say this is not the case. This should not be the case, at least not in Europe. But we should take functionality into account when we define and implement the right level of privacy. And I will give maybe another example. Again, the Corona app. I think that what we have right now is, from a technical point of view, as just mentioned, very accurate as regards to privacy. However, I missed at the beginning, when the app was designed, a discussion between the different stakeholders that also Paul mentioned, also the general public, of what we want to actually achieve with this application. Do we want to have a notification app? Then it's perfect. Or do we want to have an instrument to better manage, let's say, lockdowns? And if we want to do the latter, what kind of privacy do we need? Do we need maybe to share then location data, which will be shared to particular trusted parties? And in return, we might get hopefully a better management of our freedom, which at the moment is very restricted. So I think that if we are balancing these kind of trade-offs, if you want, so we can start thinking of the design. And I think the design is absolutely the key. So the privacy by design paradigm should be here leading. And here you have these two paradigms. How much do you do only by technical means that I just mentioned before, and how much do you do by data governance, by social organizational governance measures? And here standardization can bring together those engineers that were mentioned before by Amelia, but also by the stakeholders that are directly or indirectly affected by the product and services. And by the way, the standardization should also and is already also bringing together the policymakers. I think that all standardization bodies, including IEEE, has a government engagement program where governments can bring to the table the policy priorities and the general direction, and how standardization should take into account the upcoming or existing legislative measures. So another benefit, I would say, for standardization is that once you define what you want to do, how you define what kind of privacy you would like to implement, and you lay it down in a standard, that it is also transparent for everybody in the ecosystem. And that could be business partners, that could be public bodies for procurement, but it could be also the end user. And once you have standards and certifications, there are also visible means for the different parties to assess what is inside, let's say so, which is very difficult to assess otherwise. So I see standardization also a means to establish trust in this ecosystem of products and services with different, privacy requirements from the user side, and which are also offered then by the different providers.
Well, thank you, Clara. I do agree that I was also a little bit surprised when in the beginning there was a lot of optimism in terms of technical solutions. And we saw hackathons or appathons being organized without even having addressed the question why, and is this actually the best solution, and what's the real problem that we're solving? Since you addressed some of the points that Paul addressed, I'm going to give the floor to Paul first to respond.
Well, functionality beats privacy, probably true, because we are facing the classic syndrome of an invisible risk. Individuals don't really know what with their data, and also, even if they know it, they can't see themselves as victims. By the way, that's why we have obligatory car insurance, car liability insurance, because if we would just leave it to people to decide whether they take out a liability insurance or not, there would be a huge number of people who don't insure themselves because, and this is a psychological, let's say, proven empirics from insurance theory, people can't see themselves as victims. And I think these are things which we have to learn from. And privacy is not only suboptimally dealt with by the individual because they don't understand what's happening with the data and they can't see themselves as victims, but also in politics. It is often suboptimally addressed. And as a lawyer, I can say you see it from the fact that so many laws which infringe on data protection and privacy are actually annulled by the European Court of Justice or national constitutional courts. I mean, many of the surveillance laws and the Data Retention Directive and others in Europe have been annulled by courts, which shows us that politics also has a problem of dealing suboptimally with data protection and privacy. And this is the problem of the syndrome, which I would call the invisible risk, where people don't see the risk, whether it's atomic power, smoking, or data usage and data processing. Politics responds far too late and far too little to this risk. Takes ages to convince members of parliament, and that's natural because members of parliament, they look, they are representative of the people, and the people, they don't understand the problem, and therefore these things go all much too slow. And this is, I think, where the role of the technical intelligentsia comes in, and not only at the stage of making technical standards. It comes in the political process. You have to bring your knowledge, and you have to help politics to take the right step forwards rather than describing the empirics of the world. You have to turn normative. And let me say also, let's say at the other end of rulemaking, because all rulemaking must have a legitimacy from the democratic level. When it comes to standard setting, I think it's very important that these standards are fully in line with what has been decided in the democratic process. And we know that industry often uses the standard process, setting process, to undermine the legal arrangements which have been adopted by legislators. This is a problem. And I would also say that the laws are not in the first place or the second place made in order to enable standard setting. It's a completely different function. Data protection, the GDPR, is not a law which has been written for the standard setters, and that's also why it cannot contain the definitions you're looking for. It is a law about high-level responsibility of processors and controllers, which are corporations, mega corporations, and it puts obligations on them which relate to fundamental rights and actually also to democracy, because data protection and privacy is a right which is not only an individual right, it is a constitutive right of a free society and is necessary in democracy. And it gives rights to individuals. And both of this may be able to be implemented through technical standards, but that's not the only way. And I would even say that there is a certain substitutive relationship sometimes between technology, law, and, let's say, organizational arrangements. This is something on which we also have to get smarter. We have to better understand those substitutive relationships. So let's not turn the world on its head and let's say put standard setting as the central process. I think it is a very important process. I think it's good that those who are engaged in standard setting also engage with politics and try to inform and educate politics. But I would be worried if, let's say, we start to live in a world where standard setters take the lead over politics and consult politics, but actually they make the rules. I think that would not be the right way. I think the right way is democracy makes the rules, and standard setters then have to make the technical standards which implements these rules.
Thank you, Paul. Obviously, the lifespan of product and services may be very short in comparison to the lifespan of creating laws. And look at, for instance, the way the GDPR came to being. It took like 15 years, even before 15 years before that, of discussion in the various processes of the European Union. And therefore, I'm very interested to learn the position of Nicolas on this as well. And also in response to the invisible risk that Paul just brought to the table. Go ahead, Nicolas.
I have to admit that this is a big problem of politics. I mean, like the politicians, most of politicians actually talk about the past problems, not about the future, but about the issues that were actually encountered in the past. Like politics always reacts with a certain delay. And this is a problem. I mean, like when this discussion came to the question of corona tracing up, I actually right now realized that there were these two concepts, because for me it was quite like natural to understand the purpose of the app only as so to say a tool for notifying people. I was not really like expecting that someone would even like consider it as a tool for let's say for surveillance and control of movement. But now I really realize why certain people during this discussion actually promoted the idea of, let's say, centralized solution collecting the data about the movement, because that's necessary for the purpose of for the second purpose, and that now I understand their motivations. They were really like going for another, let's say, concept. And now we are talking about like how to really like decide between various concepts that are on the table. And this is not really a simple solution, or there is no simple solution, because like you expect people when they are casting their votes in the elections to be able to kind of like estimate which of the politicians will strive for what concept, or like when they are kind of like signing, let's say, terms and contracts of terms and conditions of a particular company or service, that they will like estimate what will be the consequences of their decision. I mean, like we should really kind of like be able to let's say extract those elemental those basic principles, those basic values we think that should rule the future society, and stick to them, because all this standardization will be probably done later on, but has to be guided by some, so to say, basic principles you need to really like decide for. I mean, we should generally or try to reach mutual understanding that we are striving for a society that is actually like that provides an individual freedom, that provides privacy, that democracy, human dignity, and so on, and based or use this as a, let's say, a base for like designing the respective systems we are later on using. I mean, like it's not all to promote it during the legislative process, because cannot really expect the representatives of people to be all aware of this technical complexity. So usually it is very much dependent on quite like few people who are capable or who are knowledgeable about the the respective technology, and that happens in every single parliament, every single government, and you need to kind of like choose those people wisely. Maybe one last thing about like choosing the concepts. I think it is very much also dependent on the angle you are approaching that. I mean, we have currently in the EU quite like exhaustive discussion on the encryption, because effectively the people who are let's say connected to interior ministries or let's say police services are very much interested in fighting of terrorism and stuff like that. However, on the other hand, I think the industry have not really raised the voice enough to claim that actually encryption as an important tool for, let's say, running businesses. And should it be for some reason like broken, it will have tremendous consequences on its capacities. So at that point, I believe we should really like raise the awareness also from for the people who are on, let's say, the other side of the spectrum, who take different view, because it should be really balanced. We should not trade our security for the other values. Yeah. So much to that. Maybe Amelia wants to react. I mean, I wanted.
Thank you very much. Yes, we are having a question from Simon Hania, which I may be able to tie to this question. The question is, what, according to the role and duties of protection officers with regards to technical standards? And Amelia, we've been discussing on the European level, and maybe bring it down a little bit more to the national level, where the DPAs are competent authorities, and even maybe to the city level in terms of the procurement point that you brought up. To what extent could we answer Simon's point here? And I'll reiterate his question. His question is, what, according to the panel, are the role and duties of data protection officers with regards to technical standards?
So it's okay if I talk, Rob? Okay.
Yes, please.
I think data protection officers in companies and organizations should endeavor to keep informed about ongoing progress in technical standards bodies. I would like to challenge an assertion previously made by Paul in his intervention on engineers circumventing legal norms and standards. I must say that in my work with engineers and technical standards bodies, it has not been my experience at all that engineers are anything but fully aware that the law is the law. And when they design technologies and technical solutions, they do so with a view to ensuring that their technologies are legally marketable in target markets. That said, in privacy, and especially in Europe in terms of, privacy values imbued in technologies, there are some fairly peculiar problems, such as for radio technologies that I have worked with a lot, so mobile networks and wireless networks in general. It is an essential requirement for radio technologies since the adoption of the RTTE directive in 1999 that radio technologies fulfill privacy requirements. It's an essential requirement of the radio technologies that privacy and data protection is guaranteed. So this is for more than 20 years already an essential requirements, but there's never been any specification of what this essentiality could mean. So there is no company that can in any way assess whether or not their particular technical solution contains this essential requirement for privacy and data protection or not. It is kind of an empty legal ambition which is there, but then when you go for market approval with your regulatory authority, be it a telecoms authority, a consumer protection authority, or a data protection authority, there is no more guidance. So European public authorities essentially lack the instruments to specify what values could be, or even how you could preliminary selection of privacy enhancing features, let's say. There isn't even like a framework for assessing what an essential requirement for privacy could be. And legislators are not giving regulators the tools for doing this. And even when regulators could have the tools, such as on the GDPR or in the Radio Equipment Directive from 2014, there's an opportunity for this, but it's then not being used by regulatory authorities. And so I think it is somehow in Europe is very good at having high level conclusions, like we want values in our technologies. Okay, so this is a very high level thing. And then Europe is also very good at low level things, like we need to, like in the details, like we need to have a mechanism for securely delivering data from one type of database to the different type of database. But then there's all of the things in between this high level principle and the minute details of data management, where something is somehow a bit missing, to create smooth transitions between values to practical architectures. And so I think that there is some intellectual work here to be done, to be seen what can be done by legislators, by the European Commission, by regulatory authorities, or by data protection officers, if this is your role, to fill that gap. One way which I think would be very exciting if you run away into, either procurement of web technologies or network technologies or anything that is kind of internet related, is just go out into different technical standards bodies like the IETF, IEEE, see what is already there, and maybe you will be surprised at the number of tools that you find that you can apply. And what is even better is that because of the fairly weak regulatory framework around technical standards at this time, probably you will be at liberty to choose the one which is better for you and for your organization. So you have this kind of vacuum that exists in the mid layers of policy right now, I think opens up a fair bit of scope for experimentation and trials, and choosing solutions that function optimally in your particular organization.
Thank you very much. Maybe a follow-up question then. Amelia, should current use of industry-driven standards in the EU be boosted?
I mean, I think the European Commission has already endeavored to set out a strategy for that last year, that they want to engage more with technical standards bodies that are industry-driven. And there is also a multi-stakeholder ICT panel or group which works specifically on adopting industry-driven, industry-developed standards as eligible for public procurement tenders, for instance. But the challenge is that the multi-stakeholder ICT group hasn't actually adopted anything that is made public since 2017. So even though the instrument is there, it doesn't appear to be very heavily used. And especially it doesn't appear to be having a lot of interactions with other relevant constituencies in the EU, like telecoms authorities or data protection authorities. So
Nicolas, is there a role for Parliament to play here as well? What are your views on that?
Well, maybe continuing from the previous contribution, I think always Parliament shall ensure scrutiny, democratic scrutiny, because it's directly elected body, elected by the people of the European Union or any other entity. Should we be talking generally? However, I'm always a bit skeptical when it comes to the question of kind of like micromanaging technical standards from, let's say, the parliament's position. I believe parliaments are here to, let's say, ensure that the way how the standards are being created will produce robust standards that will protect consumer, will protect privacy, will protect citizens, the citizens' right, human dignity, and so on. This should be ensured in, let's say, the general framework. However, the exact type of standardization shall be kind of like left to those specific bodies, like the people from academia, experts from. It's legitimate to invite people from industry, of course. That would be let's say my way, and we have been trying to do so. Sometimes more let's say successful, sometimes less successful. Like nowadays, the EU kind of like produces a lot of different regulations covering various fields, and the outcome is a little bit, I would say, stochastic in some cases. Sometimes it works better, sometimes not. And also, like it is important to understand the way how the legislation is being created. Like, of course, like very much of the legislation is being, or like the legislation is by definition is initiated by the European Commission. That's the body effectively, like the European government, that kind of like sets the or puts the card on the table and starts the discussion. However, later on it is being approved by the parliament, but of course also by the council, which is like the body kind of like organized by to represent the member states of the EU. And at that point, we are kind of like coming to strange conclusions sometimes, because even despite like quite the best efforts from the parliament, quite often the national governments, they are just taking like their particular like national position with respect to the local situation, and doesn't really like reflect on the others. I remember what was the position of Czech governments when we discussed cybersecurity standards. It was exactly like some reluctance to leave it quite like weak, because they were afraid that they will not be able to achieve the respective certification standards on with the let's say national capacity. I think this is kind of like resulting into that type of problems you don't want to really address during the political process. The political process should kind of like define the way for experts to reach, let's say, standards that will be convening the basic values, but rather not define the standards itself.
Thank you very much. Paul, we are still looking at the question how to bridge this gap between the technical standards and embedding these in products and services. And what I sense is that time is an important issue here. Like the European legislative process takes a long time. Are there any ways to speed up this process, and specifically on like the dominant privacy topics like the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and Digital Governance Act? I don't really see the technical standards being part of that process. So very keen to learn from your perspective here.
Well, it's very simple. GDPR provides for privacy by default and design. So any new technology development and business model which comes on the market according to the law should from the outset be implementing privacy by design and default. That's the law today. And as we see, it's not happening. And that's not in the first place a problem of the legislator or policymakers. This is a problem of enforcement, and it is actually a problem of the technological community, because, you know, are they complying with the law or not? So, you know, to come back to Clubhouse, well, where is the privacy by design in this project? So we have an enforcement problem, and we have a cultural problem in the technology sphere, where people still think, you know, let's go and break things, move fast and break things, and, you know, forget privacy by design. I think that is the problem. Let me also, just to clarify for Amelia, I didn't say engineers are undermining the legislation. I'm saying businesses, I'm saying companies are doing it. And I would agree and that's my experience with IEEE. I have been in dialogue with them for a very long time. The engineers as individuals are great people. They want to do good things. They want to build good things for the world. And they are, on the contrary, I think, you know, the people of the technical intelligentsia, they need to be invited to the table much more, and they have good intentions. But unfortunately, we live in the world of greed. We still just remember we're living, you know, in capitalism with, you know, a system which incentivizes bugs as free riders at the cost of others. And that is the problem. And I have actually, in a similar panel last year, heard all the evidence from other speakers about business trying to undermine what has been reached in legislation in technical standard settings. So, you know, I'm not in technical standard bodies, I don't know, but I think it's very likely because, you know, we also see that the business models, not only in technical standards, but the business models of many big players of the digital economy know it and continue to make money. So let's not be naive on these things. On the question of Simon Hania, what's the job of the data protection officer in relation to technical standards? Well, exactly. The job of the data protection officer is to make sure that from the outset, the law is respected in the technical development inside the company, but also when the company participates in standard making bodies on data protection and privacy, I would say the data protection officer should also make damn sure that the company is not running in the wrong direction in those bodies.
Thank you very much. Obviously, Clara, I'm very interested to hear if we listen to what we've discussed today and like in terms of next steps, privacy standards are there. Maybe they're just not embedded everywhere. How do we provide for procurement managers and for data protection officers to have a choice and to actually make a choice to become compliant in the products and services they would like to see used?
Well, first of all, I would just like to mention that I completely agree with Paul and Mikuláš that we have to start from the principles. And we as engineers, we are part of, let's say, the civil society. And now speaking of IEEE, we have a public policy program and we regularly participate in expert groups and discussion rounds and position statements, so to help facilitate, let's say, also legislation as much as possible. So I think it is a bi-directional dialogue. So engineers should engage more in policy, as suggested by Paul, and on the other hand, also policy makers have to engage more in technical considerations such as standard setting and so on. I think that as next steps, what I see is quite encouraging. I see some of the public bodies such as cities who are very clearly now, especially thinking of artificial intelligence, which again poses new problems as regards to privacy, would like to define also certification mechanisms on their own, so to make sure that the products and services that they are acquiring satisfy certain standards, so that they don't run into, you know, trust problems with their citizens. I think that, you know, also from the next steps, also to address, now speaking of legislation and looking now to our policymakers here, I think we do need some more legal certainty as well as regards these new challenges. So, for instance, what implication to privacy does inferred data have? How do I control this, and what are the means that I can correct, let's say, inferred data as regards, for instance, credit scoring and so on. I would also say that we would need new standards, and so that's why I'm thinking of standards and certifications, a good mechanism for addressing the special needs for specific contexts. I'm thinking of autonomous driving, of health data, which is in public hands right now, and they don't know how they can share it because business requires this data, and also research, by the way, for training and so on. And the question is really, the public bodies again need this dialogue with the technical community to see what kind of technical measures are there for de-anonymization, for synthetic data, and so on. And here I can just bring in the example of synthetic data. According to some analysis, some training data will be synthetic data in 2 years. I think they estimate 40% of the training data will be synthetic data. However, we don't have any metrics of how to measure the quality of this synthetic data in terms of privacy, in terms of accuracy. So I think we have a lot of things to do as we take into account the specific context. And I would like to stop here.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with the potential of synthetic data in comparison to, for instance, differential privacy, which has its problems on its own. Keeping utility in de-identified and anonymous data obviously is one of the key problem areas to solve from an engineering perspective. I'd like to turn to Amelia on final thoughts from you in terms of how to close this gap. Where do you see are the opportunities?
I think that there is the largest opportunity that I would like to see filled is really figuring out a way of keeping more society actors up to speed with what the frontline technical development for data protection is. So once work has already been done, once we have the technical features and the frameworks for assessing them, how do we ensure that those features are implemented where appropriate and that the assessments are made by the actors trying to make use of these technologies or implementing them in their services, be they public or private. So I would imagine that some of the natural ways of doing this is either through consumer protection authorities, data protection authorities, or telecommunications regulators. But one could, of course, also be just, take initiative in one's own company or one's own space, and that would already go a long way towards also rewarding, I guess, industry efforts that have already been made to ensure that our technologies are a bit more privacy sensitive and a bit more robust. So if Rome wasn't built in one day, I think our infrastructures will not be either, but we can take small steps in the right direction. And we have a lot of bricks that if we lay them out well at this particular time, we will be in a better place in 2 or 3 years than we are now, for sure.
Well, thank you very much. I do like the optimistic tone in there. We have 3 minutes left, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give the floor to Nicolas and to Paul, but I asked them to be brief, like 30 minutes max, because I also wanted to close and wrap up. So Nicolas first, please. I think you are on mute.
Okay, I believe we cannot really find a single silver bullet that will resolve all problems. What I do believe is that we need sort of a political organization that will take into account or incorporate this technical intelligentsia and will be able to steer the general direction of building this new information society. Unless we will have this sort of political organization, we will not be able to introduce the standards in a proper way. So much for me.
And finally, we have Paul, and hopefully also a 30-second intervention from you, please.
I think it is important that those people who know about technology and work in technology engage with the democratic process of making laws. And this without trying to impose their way of an engineering view of the world and let's say, the technical rules of functionality of technology, but respecting language, respecting democratic process, including compromise making and majority finding. And I think in such a way they can bring technological knowledge to the rule-making process, but also go back into their technical world and work with a better understanding of the realities of democracy. And I think in the squeeze of in which democracy is today between technology and populism, this type of dialogue and engagement is vital.
Well, thank you very much. I thank you all speakers, and also specifically Francesca Bia, who could not join us in the session, but has played an important role in the preparation of this panel. I am going to write a recap of this panel session, which you can all find soon on fpf.org. And with that, I'm closing. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.